And I think what are the consequences of this radical subjective theory of value? The first one is, and you find it then in the action theory by Mises, whatever man does, he demonstrates by choosing a particular alternative his value, which as such wouldn't be a problem, because I would say that to a certain amount St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas would subscribe to this as well. But we will then see that this has a significant effect on the idea, especially in justice, and we will deal especially with justice in this lecture. The second consequence is that intersubjective value judgments are not possible. Different men have different value scales, and this is true for a wide range of choices, but not of all choices. For example, for the radical proponents of the Austrian School of Economics, it's more or less the same whether you eat or you eat not. Okay, it's also a choice. So we're not talking about the choice in the sense whether you prefer apples to pears or bread to red wine, but it's considering every single purposeful action. This is a consequence of economic policy. Since there's no intersubjective utility comparison possible, as a consequence, no act of redistribution can increase total utility. So there's a total denial of any need also for redistribution by any social entity. I'm not speaking of the state as such, but of any also a lower political entity. Unless it's voluntary. So you can give donations and then somebody else can distribute it. And especially with Mises, there's no objective dimension to human existence. So there's no metaphysical reality. So Mises, for example, would completely, both in human action and also in theory and history, he writes that if somebody claims there's something like metaphysical reality, he's just trying to enforce his view of the world to everybody else, in a nutshell. Yeah, actually there's no transcendent dimension to human existence, at least not to all men. So it's not an aspect of human nature. If you believe in a dimension to man, that's fine for you, that's then your value scale, but this has no, this is not a general statement on human nature as such. But then, I think this is very typical to all too subjective approaches, then you have a kind of pseudo-objective reality. And the one is here individualism, but this is not what I want to stress too much on, but especially also that private property is sacrosanct. As private property, this is the only, and libertarianism, the only objective dimension one has to accept. So there's no way that you interfere into another person's private property. And I speak, there's a reason why I speak of a pseudo-objective dimension, because here private property is set absolute. And even if it's the church itself defended always private property, it's not only the right to own private property which the church defended, but also there's a moral obligation to use it in a specific way. And of course there's always, the state has always, or the ruler has always the right to levy taxes on the individuals. Especially for all these expenses, a ruler has to make in order to uphold the common will, especially also to finance his expenses for his rank. So the church basically teaches that there is a twofold character of property, for example in Quadragesimo Anno. First, let it be considered as certain and established that neither Leo XIII nor those theologians who have taught under the guidance and authority of the church have never denied or questioned the twofold character of ownership. Maybe it's better to say of property. In Germany you have the two words of Eigentum and Eigentümer und Besitzer. in English they're rather sloppy with it. So if you're the owner of a thing, it does not mean that you're the proprietor of the thing. For example, a thief is the owner of the thing he has stolen, but it's not his property.
Not the same knowledge.
Yeah. Because that's where, for example, Hoppe, that's quite interesting. Even though he's German, he's rather sloppy on using he's way too often using the term ownership, whereas basically referring to property. The twofold character of ownership, maybe you can understand it that way, that that God is the proprietor in the very narrow sense of the word. So then you can use ownership also for human proprietorship. Called usually individual or social according as it regards either separate persons or the common good. Accordingly, twin rocks of shipwreck must be carefully avoided. This is mentioned already in the morning. Typical of modern thinking. Modern thinking is always extremist. So it's going in either direction and denying the other aspect of most things. So either, for example, work is everything, or work is nothing. So it's not the order of things which people are striving to find. So twin rocks of shipwreck must be carefully avoided. For as one is wrecked upon or comes close to what is known as individualism by denying or minimizing the social and public character of the right of property, so by rejecting or minimizing the private and individual character of this same right, one inevitably runs into collectivism, or at least closely approaches its tenet. So it's either basically that you deny that there's a proper use to your property, and the basic example is, I gave it already in the morning, that the family father has to feed his children. This is a strict moral obligation. So he cannot say because he's this is his property, his children he's allowed to starve his children to death. And then, of course, that's the other side, where you basically deny private property, saying that the state has to decide on everything, and that would be the extreme position on the other side. In order to place definite limits on the controversies that have arisen over ownership and its inherent duties, there must be first laid down as foundation a principle established by Leo XIII. The right of property is distinct from its use. This is, for example, something Mises and most other proponents of the Austrian School of Economics would deny. They say, I mean, if I have to use my property in a certain way, and also I would say as a moral obligation, then I'm not actually the property owner as such. Because as a property owner, I have the right to dispose of my property as much as I will. And this is basically the Roman law notion of property, where you see it as a dominium. So you have also the right to destroy your property, whereas the Occidental position is more that you see property as a patrimonium. So you have inherited it from your parents and they from their parents, and in the end everybody received it from God. And basically your first duty is to use it in such a way that you can inherit it to the next generation as well. And basically in economic terms that's very clever, because what the result of this is that basically it's a low rate of time preference. It's basically a moral argument that you should not... Is it?
There is maybe more.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen.
Then,
No,
okay, I would. If it's too loud, please. So, is it better? Or is it low? Okay. That you have a rather low time preference, because basically it's a moral obligation to not consume the inheritance of your parents. The justice called commutative commands sacred respect for the division of possession and forbids invasion of others' rights through the exceeding of the limits of one's own property. So basically property is also protected, it has to be protected. But the duty of owners to use their property only in the right way does not come under this type of justice, but under other virtues, obligations of which cannot be enforced by legal actions. This is basically charity, and this is the difference between the Catholic teaching and then in the end communism, where you have a mechanical redistribution through the state and not through voluntary, but still obligatory acts of man. Therefore, they are in error who assert that ownership and its right use are limited by the same boundaries. The one is legal, the other is moral. And it's much farther still from the truth to hold that a right to property is destroyed or lost by reason of abuse or non-abuse. So here it's even not much stronger. So just by abusing your right to power, the state has no title to restrict your use of private property. But I would say that as a politician, of course, you have also a responsibility for society. So I mean, if it's getting too far, then it's at least quite likely that certain restrictions on the use of property will be executed. And I would say that one should not be surprised if an individualistic notion leads to the idea that a family doesn't care for itself anymore, that then you have demands for a social state. But this is just now on an empirical level. I think you can see that also when we come to the theory of the just wage, when everybody's just paid the same and then you're not allowed to make discrimination according whether some person is married or not, what you then have is that family allowances are instituted by the state. Because people argue, of course, as a family father, you have more material needs as an individual person, which then is a question of distributive justice. So now we come to the notion of justice. For the Austrian School of Economics, and you see it's more or less than going into libertarianism, but still if you keep within economics and the theory of redistribution, basically they hold that any voluntary exchange is perceived as a positive sum game, exempting fraud, one has to add. And the definition of voluntariness is just a negative one. That's the absence of coercion or the threat thereof. So then every other act is voluntary. And Jeffrey Tucker writes in an article just recently, he's writing about an exchange. Is there justice in this exchange? Most certainly. And why? Because they agreed voluntarily. That's all there is to it. And this is the last sentence I want to highlight. That's again the extremist position of it. That's all there is to it. It's called the non-aggression axiom then, and exploitation and justice is then only the use of force or the threat thereof. And I want now to present a little bit the Occidental position, and first quote from Aristotle, and I will start with the idea of voluntariness. And you will see that there's a different take on voluntariness, and which has then significant effects also on the idea of justice. Aristotle writes in the Nicomachean Ethics, it is then generally held that actions are involuntary when done A, under compulsion, or B, through ignorance. So ignorance is also already a reason for an involuntary action. So if you don't know what you're doing, then we cannot speak to you that you're acting truly voluntarily, because you have to know also what the consequences of your action